Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm Paula Caballero. I'm the Global Director of the Climate Program at WRI, and it's my honor to welcome you to the WRI event 1 year later. Has the world moved on since President Trump's announcement on the Paris Agreement? I'd like to start off, though, by saying that my own personal reflection actually kicks off on the 9th of November of 2016. I was in Marrakesh at the climate conference at that time, and if anything, what I witnessed was a renewed commitment to delivering on Paris. I've been at many COPs. I was at COP1, so that should tell you something. And Marrakesh really stood out for its sense of purpose and of commitment. And what was memorable, what I remember, was the steady uptick of countries that continued to ratify the agreement that day and the following weeks, with really signaling a very steely determination to carry on. And that's what I remember from that moment. And now, 18 months later, that same decisiveness is very much evident. Trump can announce what he will, but the reality on the ground in the US and around the world is that effort to tackle climate continue regardless and unabated. And as someone who has been involved in the climate regime for, as you can now guess, several decades, I can bear witness to the fact that there has been steady progress forward. If you ask me, is it fast or decisive or transformative enough? Not at all, but it has been relentless. So we're really deeply honored today to have so many distinguished leaders from government, from finance, from international relations, to join us to reflect on where we are, on how the American people have responded, and indeed how the world has responded. But before I turn over the floor to our very distinguished senior fellow, Andrew Light, who will introduce the distinguished speakers and moderate the conversation, I would like to share with you three brief thoughts. Firstly is that whether Trump wants to ignore it or not, climate change is real and it's happening now, and the impacts are being felt around the world. 2017 was the second hottest year on record worldwide. You all remembered what happened in California. The pictures of the wildfires are very much with us. And in Australia, they broke 260 records on heat and rainfall. Puerto Rico is still recovering from Hurricane Maria, and new numbers are coming up of what that devastation really looked like. And of course, as always, it's the poorest and the most vulnerable that face the greatest, most irreversible impacts. And I won't go into the statistics on the number for Africa, but let me tell you, they're daunting and sobering. So the second point that is important is that even if the Trump administration is abdicating its historic, and I would say it's historic responsibility, and Todd is here with us, and he is witness to that historic leadership of the US, if they're abdicating that responsibility to lead on climate, US states, US cities, and businesses are pushing forward with actions that will help to bend the needle on emissions in the US. They know that if they don't keep up, they risk being left behind in a new future powered by clean energy, a sustainable future, regardless of what action takes place at federal level. To date, as an indicator of this, for example, 74 businesses have committed to set science-based targets for emission reduction, which align their businesses with the Paris targets. So businesses are talking the walk, walking the talk. And last December, as you all know, California Governor Jerry Brown and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg launched America's Pledge. It was a new effort to mobilize non-federal climate action. And the initiative was kicked off with the release of analysis that was authored by WRI together with partners Rocky Mountain Institute, which found that states, cities, and businesses representing more than half of the US economy and population have adopted GHG targets. And very importantly, a similar proportion have declared their support for the Paris Agreement. Think of this. If they were a country, these US states and cities alone would be the third largest economy in the world. That matters. That speaks. And this September, WRI, together with our partners, Rocky Mountain Institute and the University of Maryland, we're helping to author the next America's Pledge report, which will determine how much these non-federal efforts can help to drive emissions downward to achieve the US's 2025 climate goal. And that's for the US. So my third point is, what about the rest of the world? And as I said at the beginning, the momentum continues to grow internationally. For example, since last June, over 20 countries committed to phasing out coal power. France, UK, China, Ireland, Scotland, Israel, Costa Rica all came forward with announcements or a plan to ban the sale of fossil fuel-powered vehicles by 2024, 2040 or sooner. New Zealand, for its part, committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and the UK indicated that it might well follow suit. China announced that it would restore 6.6 million hectares in 2018. That's an area equivalent to the size of Ireland. And the last two countries that had not ratified the Paris Agreement, Syria and Nicaragua, did so. So now the only outlier is the US. And in parallel to all of this, the negotiations are continuing apace. Country negotiators have continued to work to finalize and will continue to work to finalize the implementation guidelines of the Paris Agreement. So I think all of this points very clearly to the progress that is being made in the US around the world. It's doubtless encouraging. But if we're really honest, we need a lot more ambition. We need to do much more if we're going to stay well under 2 degrees, as we all committed to in 2015. So that means that countries, but companies and businesses all have to step up. And there's no time to waste. What is really daunting about where we are right now and exhilarating at the same time is that whether we act today or we don't act today is going to determine what the world will look like for centuries to come. What kind of economies and societies will be viable is what we get to determine. We not only need to avoid locking in emissions trajectories, but as I often like to remind people, it's locking out all the good stuff and the real possibilities for sustainable and inclusive development trajectories. So thinking about this incredible moment that we're at today, I now have the privilege to turn the panel and the event over to Andrew Light, and he will be moderating what I'm sure will be a lively and timely conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula. Can I have our speakers join me up here at the front? So welcome, everyone. Sorry, I see. Welcome, everyone. And welcome to those of you who are watching, either on C-SPAN or Facebook or any other platforms we're going to broadcast on today. Let me just explain how we're going to run the panel today. As Paul said, I'll start with some brief introductions. I'm going to then lead a conversation here for about 35, 40 minutes with our panelists who represent a range of positions and views and experiences, both on domestic and international climate and clean energy policy. And then after that, we'll open it up to you for about 25 minutes or so, and then close the session. So let me just start with the introductions. Immediately to my left here is Todd Stern, who in the last administration served as Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State. As the U.S. chief negotiator, he navigated political deadlocks, strengthened closer relations between China and a number of other countries on clean energy investments, and was, as Paul just said correctly, one of the key architects of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Next to him is Ambassador Selwyn Hart, who served as the lead negotiator on finance for the Alliance of Small Island Developing States in the negotiations through Paris. He was also director for that of the UN Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team, and is now Ambassador of Barbados to the United States. Next to Ambassador Hart, we have Val Smith, who is the Managing Director and Global Head of Corporate Sustainability at Citi. She oversees the company's global sustainability initiatives, including their $100 billion environmental finance goal, instituting their commitment last fall to source 100% of Citi's energy needs from renewable resources by 2020. Next to Val, we have Secretary Ben Grimbles, who is Secretary of the Environment for the state of Maryland. He leads the state's work on environmental protection and climate change there with Governor Hogan. He is currently also chair of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We hear a lot about RGGI, as it's called. We're not supposed to use acronyms, but I really like the acronym RGGI, so Regional Greenhouse, remember RGGI. The first mandatory market-based U.S. program to reduce emissions among northeastern and mid-Atlantic states, and we hope soon to be expanded to the south. So next to Ben, we've got Angela Navarro, who's Deputy Secretary of Commerce and Trade for the state of Virginia. She was previously Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources, and she's worked with Governor Northam now in expanding the state's renewable energy sector through major financial investments in clean energy technologies and utility-scale solar power. And then at the end of the row here, we have my colleague, David Waskow, who's director of WRI's International Climate Initiative, which works to advance the Paris Agreement and action in other international policy arenas. The ultimate aim of strengthening climate action in countries and in key sectors. He's been a long member of the climate community in Washington and elsewhere. Previously, he worked with Oxfam and Friends of the Earth. Okay, so Todd, we're going to start with you. How would you assess the Paris Agreement has withstood the test of President Trump's announcement a year ago this week for his intention to withdraw from it? Where are you seeing signs of leadership? Where do you think we still need some more progress?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks to everybody at WRI for putting this event on, and a pleasure to be up on the stage with all of my fellow panelists. Look, Andrew, I think it's a mixed. Bag. I think that the first most important piece of good news, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion, was that other countries stayed in. I think sort of doubled down in their general determination not to walk away, not to let the United States just, to use the president's words during the campaign, not to let the United States cancel the agreement. So that was a very important thing. I think President Xi from China showed up in Davos in January I guess 2017, and said right away China is committed, staying in, and everybody else has stayed in. So that, to that extent, that's very good news, and we shouldn't look past that. And by the way, I'm just going to confine my comments right now to the international side. We have several people up here to talk about the domestic side. The less positive part of it is that it's really damaging for the United States to be on the way out. You probably know, if you're in this room, that we're not actually out yet, that under the agreement, we can't literally be withdrawn until November 4th of 2020, which by pure coincidence is the day after the 2020 election. But so we can submit a formal notice of withdrawal in November 2019. That has to lay over for a year. So it's 2020 before the U.S. could get out. And there is, the president in principle left the door open to coming back in, as he said. But in any event, we have this announcement that has been made. The president has made clear his intention to withdraw. The whole kind of sense of things from the senior levels of the Trump administration is to be not interested in climate change and to be not intending to stay in Paris. So that has a very damaging impact, and I've seen it in a couple of ways. I, by the way, went to the COP for several days in November, and I went again to the intersessional meeting just a few weeks ago in Bonn, and spent about 3 days there, probably met with 25 countries, and the LDCs and the least developed countries and the G77 and a whole slew of people from every part of the spectrum. So I think there's two things two ways that I see the U.S. posture as being undermining and difficult right now in terms of the negotiations. Number one is there is in the negotiations themselves, and the second is on, broadly speaking, the ambition side, but I have a specific point I want to make about ambition. But on the negotiation side, there are a whole number of follow-on steps that are being negotiated this year, meant to be finished this year in Katowice in Poland in November at the COP. This is sometimes referred to in the press as the rule book, but it's a bunch of different guidelines and measures meant to implement provisions of Paris, and it's really important. And there are guidelines for transparency. There's discussions about the kind of information you have to submit when you submit your target. There's accounting, there's compliance, there's all sorts of things that have to get dealt with. And I think that in the absence of the United States, you have a phenomenon of a fair number of countries, I think, trying to pull back a little bit from some of the things that were agreed to, some of the compromises that were reached in Paris. I think that there is generally a sense among many countries that countries in many cases extended themselves maybe past even the point where they were entirely comfortable, but they saw that this was a big moment. They saw that the United States was walking arm in arm with China, at the presidential level. They understood that there were elements of this thing that needed to be done in such a way that the United States could actually join the agreement, which is never a foregone conclusion, and people extended themselves. So they, having done that, turn around and the United States says, actually, never mind, we're gone. So that is a very difficult dynamic, and I think it is both in my observation and in many times and in many comments that people from across the spectrum have made to me, damaging in terms of finding a way forward on some of these points. With respect to the other thing I was going to say is that Paris, look, remember the targets in Paris, the so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are not binding. There's a binding transparency and accountability system, but not the targets themselves. It had to be, in my judgment, had to be done that way in order to get broad agreement. But it is a feature of Paris. And so if you think, well, how are we going to get the kind of ambition that we need to get over time, there has to be a growing development of norms and expectations within countries of the world, not just within the negotiating community, but in the countries, to keep ramping up and ramp up more and more and faster. So you see the United States, the biggest historic emitter, the second biggest emitter now, and the country which for so many years has been viewed in all sorts of in areas well beyond climate change as, to use Madeleine Albright's phrase, the indispensable power, suddenly saying, never mind. What's the impact of that on that sense of developing norms and expectations? Obviously not good. So I think countries are still in. They're determined to go forward. They want to implement the agreement. That's all great. But don't underestimate the negative side of the U.S.'s position.
Thanks very much. I want to bring in Ambassador Hart and David now to sort of launch from this platform that Todd has set for us. So where do you think the coalitions, right, that really got us the ambition out of Paris? I mean, full disclosure, I was working for Todd during Paris, and we all came together in the High Ambition Coalition and other initiatives to really sort of, I think it's fair to say, got a much stronger agreement than many of us thought we really were going to get leading into those negotiations, which is unusual in these kinds of forums, very difficult. We got over 190 countries. They've all got to agree on the same thing to move forward. Makes the U.S. Senate look pretty easy, actually. You need 60 out of 100. In this forum, you need everyone to agree to move forward in terms of ambition. Where do you think we are in terms of holding that ambition together, Ambassador Hart? And where do you think we are in terms of the coalition, right, that is really going to move forward in this time when as Todd said, the U.S. is pretty much on the sidelines, at least in the formal negotiations?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Andrew. And first, let me thank WRI and my other colleagues here, especially my good friend Todd Stern. We sat across each other many long days and nights, usually opposing each other, but we nevertheless became friends. And I say that to lead into the Paris, to what occurred in Paris a couple of years ago, where despite enormous differences around legal form, around the intricacies of the agreement and the necessary approaches to solve this global problem, countries coalesced around a very ambitious agreement. No one got everything they wanted. We wanted those targets that Todd spoke about to be very ambitious and be legally binding. We did not get that. But everyone decided that it was in the best interest, not only of their individual countries and future generations, but the world in general. If we could craft an ambitious global agreement that responded to the defining global challenge of our time. And despite the decision by the U.S. administration, current U.S. administration, to withdraw or to announce its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, I nevertheless believe that the coalition that delivered the Paris Agreement remains strong. It was not only a coalition of countries, it was also a coalition of civil society actors and real economy actors. And we're seeing an amazing amount of mobilization in the real economy around the goals and aspirations of the Paris Agreement. And I think that that's a very positive sign. Certainly in my own region, because for us, climate change is not some esoteric scientific debate or discussion. It's a reality, right? And in 2017, we saw some of the most devastating and destructive hurricanes that we've ever seen in our entire history. So therefore, when we have these discussions on the Paris Agreement and taking action on climate change, it carries loss of life implications, or it has loss of life implications. So in my own region, governments have decided to be even more ambitious than they were going into Paris. Just last Thursday, we had a general election in my country where we elected the first female prime minister in our history. And she has already announced or promised that by 2030, Barbados will move towards will transition towards being 100% carbon neutral, the first 100% carbon neutral island in the world. And if anyone who knows her knows that she will keep that promise. So throughout the Caribbean and in other regions, you are seeing countries recognize that there are opportunities, real economy opportunities for taking action on climate change. So my response to your question is that the coalition remains strong. We want the U.S. to be back at the table and engage in a constructive manner. However, countries are not going to wait until the U.S. reassumes its position of leadership. Countries are already taking actions to implement or even exceed their Paris commitment. However, we need the U.S. back at the table. It is absolutely imperative to have the U.S. at the table. Were it not for the leadership of the United States, were it not for the leadership of Todd, although I disagreed with him sometimes, we would not have had the Paris Agreement. I can say that unashamedly, we would not have had the Paris, this ambitious global agreement, were it not for the leadership of the United States. So we really absolutely need the U.S. back at the table.
David, same question. How are we in terms of holding together the coalitions of ambition? Are you seeing new signs of leadership in response to what's happened the last year? Also, what are the accelerating moments we should look forward to in terms of what are the signs to look forward to in the next year, the year after that, right, until we sort of potentially get another realignment in the global politics on this issue?
Thanks. So I think one of the most remarkable things about what's happened during the Trump administration or Trump era and the response to the withdrawal announcement or the intent to withdraw announcement by President Trump has been the reaction. Paolo alluded to this earlier, I think. When the election happened, many of us were in Marrakesh for COP22, which was happening at the time, and the sense of determination that one felt throughout the halls there was quite remarkable. The sense that countries and beyond countries, it included cities, states, businesses who were there, and civil society. The determination to carry on was palpable, and I think that came through as well in the wake a year ago of the announcement by President Trump that he intends to withdraw from the agreement. We saw the upwelling of literally hundreds of companies and cities and states saying that they are still in the lingo of one of the alliances built in response. And I think that has carried on. And that then brings us forward to those next moments that that really can carry forward the flag. And I don't want to suggest that we be naive or Pollyanna about the situation. The reality of this administration is something that many are keenly aware of around the world. And yet there is this clear determination to carry on. And some of the things coming down the pike that I think are those moments that will test that determination are both within negotiations and outside them. The Global Climate Action Summit coming up in September in California, which is in large part meant to highlight the actions that cities and states and businesses and other actors are taking, but I think will bring a surprising number of countries to the mix as well and show the ways in which those, quote, non-state actors can work collaboratively with governments. That then will carry us forward, I think, and I think we will see a quite potent showing there. That then will carry us forward to the COP this year, COP24 in Poland, which Todd mentioned. And there we are really on the cusp of two major decision points, I think. One has to do with the set of rules or guidelines for the Paris Agreement. And this really should be seen as the mobilizing ingredients, the catalytic ingredients for the Paris Agreement. So not a set of strictures per se, but how do we really put in place the building blocks that are going to allow the Paris Agreement to come into full life and really have traction on the ground. And countries are very determined to get the foundational elements of that set of guidelines and rulebook in place by this COP. There's a lot of work left to be done. There will have to be stepped up pace to get there. But that is the goal that's been established. The second piece for the COP has to do with ambition. And here, we're really in the midst of the first 5-year cycle under Paris. Paris established a series of 5-year cycles to increase ambition and strengthen action. This one is perhaps less definitively spelled out in the agreement than some that come after, starting in 2025. But nonetheless, many countries, and we saw this at the intersessional negotiations in Bonn several weeks ago, have made clear that they see this as an important milestone. And so driving toward that objective at the COP and more importantly, having a clear sense of direction for increasing action by 2020 is another of those milestones. And then next year, the UN Secretary General has announced that the UN will be holding a major climate summit in New York on the sidelines or during, I think better to say, the UN General Assembly. And while plans for that are still being laid, I think it does become an important moment, especially heading toward 2020 and that increased ambition. And then the last thing I'll say very quickly is that one of the things that we're witnessing is a real change in some of the dynamics internationally around how action is being taken and what the alliances are that are taking action. We're seeing that in part outside of government action with the cities and states and businesses who have banded together not only in the U.S. but across countries to a remarkable degree. And then we're also seeing it with governments. India, for example, has generated the creation of the International Solar Alliance, which now has over 60 countries as members. It's an intergovernmental organization in the formal sense, and it is mostly in tropical countries going to drive forward renewable energy options. We're seeing in Africa, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, which now has a goal of 300 gigawatts of renewables in Africa by 2030. And all of that together, I think, shows the degree to which we are witnessing a change globally in the types of leadership that we have. It's a distributed leadership model. It's not one, although clearly we need the U.S. in the game at the end of the day. It's not one that depends just on major parties. It's one that has many, many more actors in the mix and driving forward action.
Excellent. And great segue to, I'm going to turn to Secretary Grumble's Angela Navarro and Val Smith now. And I think Paula showed the pictures of this, and people keep using this term COP. And if you're not a unrecoverable climate geek like most of us, then this is Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Thank God there's an acronym for that. So it's Conference of the Parties. It's these annual meetings. We're all just terribly impressed. You were all there with the show of leadership from your industries, from your states. The immediate, within a week, we had Jerry Brown going to China. A week after President Trump makes his Rose Garden announcement, goes to China, is in the Great Hall of the People with Xi Jinping and talks climate change. So there has just been a tremendous upwelling of this. We've got America's Pledge. We are still in the U.S. Climate Alliance. It goes on, these different organizations of businesses in the states that have come together in cities. So where do we go from here? Say a little bit about your particular insights into the process of building those alliances, the process of creating them, of creating momentum around them, letting the American people know they exist in a way they probably never did before, right? And then how do you see that leadership unfolding over the next couple years? So let's just go down the line. Val, we'll start with you, and then to Ben, and then Angela.
Sure. Well, first of all, there it is. I want to join everybody in thanking WRI for pulling us together for, I think, as much as anything, what is a celebration of the actions that have taken place over the past year. And it's really an honor to be here with the state and national and international leaders in this space. Citigroup has been quite active in this space, both in terms of our support of the Paris Agreement leading up to COP21 in Paris, as well as our financing of climate solutions. And, Andrew, you wanted us to talk a little bit about sort of how we've joined together with other institutions. I first want to say that Citi is the most global bank in the world. We have people on the ground in 98 countries, and we do business in 160 countries. So we really come to this issue partly out of our efforts to live our mission and value proposition to enable growth and progress. It's partly because of our role as a global citizen, and it's partly because of the business opportunity in the climate solution space. When Paula was doing her opening remarks, she said, one of the things about having sound climate policy is that you want to make sure you're not locking out all the good stuff. And I think the good stuff is really what you see as such a huge motivator for so many companies in the climate solution space. For Citi, we have a $100 billion environmental finance goal that we announced in 2015, and we've supported our clients in $57 billion worth of climate environmental solutions in 4 years since that goal was announced. And, I think what we've been very pleased to see, and we're one voice within thousands of voices that through either their statements or their business actions have said we are still in the Paris Agreement. We really see this as sort of this inevitable motion progress from our clients that is pulling all of us in the right direction in terms of climate solutions. Specifically focusing on how we've been able to join together, I think we have been quite pleased to partner with both competitors and our clients and other companies to make a few different statements leading up to Paris. We joined together with the other major U.S. banks to state our support for a global climate agreement. After there was talk about whether or not the United States would stay in the Paris Agreement, our CEO, Michael Corbat, joined with many other CEOs in an open letter published in the Wall Street Journal to say the Paris Agreement is important to our business. And after Trump announced that he intended for the U.S. to withdraw from the United States or from the Paris Agreement, we issued a statement saying that we were disappointed, but through our statements and our actions, we are still in. So, I think that for companies, we really want to focus on what is possible today, what is possible tomorrow, bringing solutions to our clients. And I think that's what we've seen is that that's been an incredible mobilizer for companies. We understand the importance of this issue. We understand the importance of the Paris Agreement, and we understand the importance of policy certainty. And our hope through We Are Still In and other coalitions is that we can help to sort of create the continued momentum to fill the gap with states, with cities, with all the other countries, to sort of bridge the gap and get us to a place where we are again looking at a successful and fulsome implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Great. Well, very quickly, Governor Larry Hogan, Republican governor of Maryland, directed me, his environment secretary, to go to Bonn to be part of COP23 to learn and to share and to underscore that there is nothing more practical than the preservation of health and beauty. And the key to preserving our health, our environment, our economy in Maryland. All of you are not just in the nation's capital right now, you're in the heart of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And the preservation of our beauty, the natural resources, means we need to find bipartisan solutions. So the opportunity to learn from so many other countries and to be with states that were united in the effort to reduce greenhouse gases and increase resiliency and learn and work with the business community and the NGOs made us very excited in Maryland and looking forward to take next steps and follow through with policies and actions in Maryland. Think globally, act locally, and invest locally in Maryland. All of you. Thanks.
Or in Virginia. Yeah, in the watershed, that's right.
Way going on here.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Right.
That's not unusual. So I think, Ben obviously set up a really great conversation about the things that the states are doing. I think a lot of people would recognize that most of the climate action, or a lot of the climate action that was taking place in the United States, was happening at the state level pre-Paris Agreement. And the work that we're doing through a variety of collaborations, whether it be We Are Still In, the U.S. Climate Alliance, the Commonwealth is moving forward with a regulatory program where we would, for the first time, a southeastern state will place a limit on carbon pollution from power plants and link to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Yes, so we're very excited about all of these actions, and a lot of these activities were occurring before President Trump's announcement. But I think the importance of the work that the states are doing has only been amplified since the announcement from President Trump a year ago. The coalitions, the U.S. Climate Alliance, We Are Still In, Virginia signed the Under 2 MOU. A lot of this work I think would have occurred naturally, but it gave us kind of a galvanizing point. And there's so much excitement at the state level in terms of investing in our clean energy economy, growing new businesses around resiliency. For coastal states like Virginia and Maryland, water resiliency is incredibly important and something that we're thinking about every single day. So there are a lot of opportunities for the states to step forward and to take a more leadership role in the absence of the federal government doing so. That's not to say that we wouldn't like to see more federal action. I think consistent regulatory programs nationwide are the preference. Our businesses in the Commonwealth, and I'm sure all across the state, all across the nation, would appreciate that the consistency of a strong regulatory program rather than piecemeal state approaches. But the states are close to the ground. We have to live in reality. We have tremendous problems associated with the impacts of climate change that we're dealing with on a daily basis. And we have to take action. We have to be beholden to our constituents and the people who elected my boss into office. And a significant factor in that is addressing the impacts of climate change, whether it be reducing carbon pollution from the energy sector through our new regulatory program that would link to RGGI, looking at advanced transportation, bringing in new businesses, expanding our clean energy economy, and addressing the resiliency of our communities with a particular focus on our coastal communities.
Thank you. Let's drill down a little layer, another layer here. Here at the World Resources Institute, we are very much in favor of a good, solid, conservative idea that one of the ways that you attack this problem is you price the pollution. So Ben, you're chair now of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the oldest trading system, carbon trading system in the United States, prices the pollution. Virginia's poised now to join. Can you say more about the role of these regional trading systems? Are they inherently limited because we don't have a national system, because you're confined geographically? What's the future of them? Do you see a way in which we could imagine RGGI taking a step that California's taken with its system and linking? Now it's linked to both the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. So what's the current status of that, and what's the future?
And we certainly enjoyed, along with Maryland and several other states who are current participants and members of RGGI in Bonn, sharing ideas and thoughts about our experiences. And it's a tremendous track record over the last, almost the last decade. These 9 states have slashed carbon emissions from the power plant sector and generated, in addition to that, it's all focused on environmental progress, generating $2.9 billion in revenue divided among the states for investing in clean energy and energy efficiency and ratepayer assistance and resiliency. And the key to us was that 83 days after the president announced the withdrawal of the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, the 9 states were extremely diverse geographically and politically, from New England to Maryland and Delaware, reached consensus to strengthen and extend the program beyond 2030. And the price question is key for us all to ensure that there are mechanisms like a cost containment reserve, different safety valves that are involved in the auction process, which is critically important so that each of the states and the power sector and our constituencies within those states and RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, understand that this strategy for environmental and economic security into the future is also consistent with the theme of not just clean energy, but affordable and reliable energy. And so it's an auction system based on the market price, the quarterly auctions. But we also have mechanisms such as a cost containment reserve if the prices get too high. Or I think a really important breakthrough that WRI and others in the environmental community and academic community were involved in was that we announced that we would be including an emissions containment reserve as well to ensure that that cap on overall emissions for the regional effort would continue to decrease and that we would continue to see environmental progress. And so our effort as we reach out to the Commonwealth of Virginia and New Jersey, which is also very excited and focused on rejoining RGGI, is that we find the right mix of autonomy and flexibility among the states and use price mechanisms to ensure that there won't be unaffordable or unreliable energy supplies among the states. So it's I think, one of the most powerful and uplifting messages in the country and around the world that this RGGI, when we become 11 states, if that is the case, and I hope it will be, we'll have somewhere between the 4th and 5th largest economy in the world. I mean, when you take those 11 states into account, even though it's focused just on the power sector right now, that's still a very powerful and uplifting message to others that in a totally bipartisan manner, states in the United States are moving forward and reducing emissions and benefiting their state economies.
So Angela, can you walk us through what it's like to be on the side of trying to emerge into one of these markets. I mean, that's clearly for now, I mean, that really is the future of a pricing system. You've just finished recently your public comment period on this. I mean, you were with us from the beginning, from the last administration, into this administration, the new gubernatorial administration. There's been some tension there with the state legislature already. So how are you growing support for this? How's the process look from the inside of being one of those states on the cusp of making a big step like this?
It's a really great question. Obviously, the collaborative effort with the RGGI states has been key. I will say Virginia started down this pathway a number of years ago. It didn't happen overnight. And it started with our stakeholder engagement around the Clean Power Plan, around EPA's federal regulation covering carbon emissions from the power sector. And in our stakeholder engagement in talking to industry groups, environmental groups, science-based groups, everyone across the board recognized the power of a market and the power of establishing a program that was trading ready, which was the beauty of the Clean Power Plan, is that there was the flexibility for states to embark upon that type of regulatory program. So as we were moving through the process of working through our own state regulatory approach to comply with the Clean Power Plan was stayed at the federal level by the Supreme Court. And we actually had a meeting of our stakeholders that week and asked them, do you want to continue? And everyone unanimously said, yes, we want to continue working through this because our utilities, for example, are pricing carbon in their long-range plans. Carbon is known as the mother of all externalities. It's a huge regulatory risk for our manufacturers and industry. And so they wanted to continue to have these conversations. That's not to say that they all love the result, but they were all at the table and they were part of the discussion. And in a state like Virginia that certainly is a purple state where you've got a majority Republican legislature, but then 2 consecutive Democratic governors with Governor McAuliffe and then Governor Northam, that was key to get those stakeholders in the room and to have those conversations. We knew we needed to move forward via an executive action rather than through legislation because we did not have the votes in our General Assembly to have a more comprehensive approach that would let us fully take advantage of the benefits of RGGI. So, for example, Virginia is not directly auctioning the allowances, and we do not actually get the revenue. So Ben mentioned the significant investment that RGGI states have made from the auction revenue that comes via the RGGI auction. Virginia does not have the ability to do that. So the revenue will go back to the utilities and will be essentially refunded back to customers on their electric utility bills. But certainly bringing all of those groups together, recognizing that we needed consistent action. We saw that there was uncertainty at the federal level. There was, I think, political momentum for us to move in this direction. And then with the election, so the draft rule went out right after the election, at the state election where Governor Northam was elected. And Governor Northam committed to continuing on the path of moving forward with the regulatory program that was established under Governor McAuliffe.
Thanks. So I want one more question of Al, and then we're going to start opening it up. I mean, part of the way that I think that that we think about these kinds of programs really is that you're building a coherent and consistent overall economic system, which is going to create a growth model that lives up to the realities of climate change. And one of the other things that Citigroup is involved in has been the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, so that companies are really, this is a big report, Mike Bloomberg, and the chair of the Bank of England did just recently on this, trying to come up with recommendations on how to move forward on a system of climate risk disclosures, help to inform investors, help to create long-term stability in terms of your investments. Can you tell us something about Citi's support for that program, how you think that's going? Are we going to get, do you feel momentum, merging on that in the same way we do with some of these other programs we've been talking about?
Sure. So earlier I talked about our financing of climate solutions, and this is really the other side of that coin. How do financial institutions, how do companies assess climate risk and risk to their business from climate change? So Andrew was referring to something called the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. And the TCFD recommendations were released by the task force in June of 2017, so a year ago, another anniversary. These recommendations ask financial institutions as well as provide guidance to other more carbon-intensive sectors to provide disclosure across a whole host of different climate-related risks. They ask companies to provide disclosure on their climate change governance, who in the company is responsible for assessing climate change. They ask companies to provide disclosure on your climate change strategy, climate change metrics, your targets. And there's a particular piece of this that I think really stumped a lot of companies, and it's around to consider doing scenario analysis to see how your company would perform in different warming scenarios. So we've been reporting on climate-related issues and metrics since 2002. We started reporting on our environmental footprint in 2002, including our energy use and greenhouse gas emissions associated. We had a long history of continually ramping up our disclosure in this area on the opportunity side with our $100 billion environmental finance goal, as well as on the risk side and our approach to environmental and social risk management with our client transactions. The one piece of this around climate scenario analysis is a different way of thinking for a lot of companies. So we actually banded together with 15 other banks. We're the only U.S. bank, so it's 15 other banks from across the world through the or under the guidance of the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative, or UNEP-FI, another acronym. And we banded together. We hired 2 consultants to help us build methodologies and models for looking at physical risk from climate change and what that would do to our businesses and our loan portfolios, as well as transition risk. If we are so fortunate to to be able to keep warming to 1.5 or 2 degree scenario, what does that look like? What does the global economy look like? And what does our business look like? So we're still in process with developing that. All of this work, because it's being done with the support of the UN, is going to be a public good. So we really feel like it's going to contribute to the overall dialogue. I think there's been a lot of focus on this, a lot of attention to how both financial institutions and other companies are going to understand their risk and report on their risk. For a bank, it might be your risk from loan portfolio impacts. To asset managers, it would be a different kind of impact. But I think that what this is really helping us with, because it's involving our bankers, our risk managers from different sectors. We've started with the energy sector and are now looking at the transportation sector, is it makes a company more climate aware, because you're pulling in so many different units to talk about how climate risk affects your business from an opportunity side and from a risk side. And so this is something that I've been talking about a lot to really demystify what it is and what it isn't, because I think all of us, whether we're in companies or states or city governments or responsible on the international scale, that becoming more climate aware and looking at how different warming scenarios affect us is a really important step to take.
I have to disclose something about financial risk that has been honestly a magic ingredient to the bipartisan success on climate action in the state of Maryland. The Climate Change Commission that our state has as a 26-member body, one of the most active members of that commission is the state elected treasurer. And the commission also recommended the aggressive 40 by 30 greenhouse gas reduction plan for the state, 40% reduction based on 2006 benchmark by 2030. But the key is that the Department of the Environment needs to track our progress and document to the governor and the General Assembly whether we are leading to a net positive impact on jobs and the economy as we go forward with that 40 by 30 goal. And financial risk is also a major reason why the state of Maryland, I think, is the first in the country to ever launch a state-supported climate leadership academy, which we did last week, which is focused on providing training and tools to local governments and businesses to deal with and to help prevent flooding and storm surge and other adverse financial impacts to property and people, the risk that climate change presents. And so it's all stemming from an awareness that financial impacts are an integral part of a broad, collaborative, and bipartisan approach to real action on reducing emissions and increasing resiliency throughout the state.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to want to come back to Angela on that question, too, talk about what Virginia's been doing on adaptation as well. We'll work that in, though. Let's first open it up, get some questions from the audience. We've got someone with microphones. Yeah, okay. And just take one over here, and then there and there. Thanks. And let's do 2-3 questions, and then we'll get some answers. Please identify yourself.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm Tim McDonald. I'm a journalist for NPR and some other publications. I'm just wondering if Mr. Stern can talk a little bit more about what the impact of the U.S. walking away from the agreement is on the parts of the agreement that deal with adaptation, loss and damage, and the kind of not like the kind of emissions mitigation parts of things, but more on that side. And because we've talked a little bit about how these coalitions of states and businesses are kind of doing their own action towards reducing emissions, but I'm wondering if that's enough to fill the gap when it comes to things like the Green Climate Fund or other kinds of financial mechanisms or that kind of thing.
What I'd like to know is you've got a group of people here who are, quote, all in because the federal government is not. And how are the emissions commitments you're making as state companies and NGOs and other people counted and enforced?
Dr. Kodavala. I'm a grad student at Arizona State. We have a number of civil organizations. We have so many entities reporting. When we look at data standards, when we look at infrastructure financing standards, what do we see as the process for adoption of standards so that data can be shared? Where's that coming from? What are the strands that you'd like to speak about? And do you see investment standards for what kinds of infrastructure ought to be financed being taken up?
This question, well, name is Amy Schmidt, represent Climate Exchange Maryland. This question is for Secretary Grumbles. I'm concerned that RGGI does not include the transportation sector, and so I'm very interested in your thoughts, being the chair, whether you think what the probability would be that RGGI could expand into the transportation sector, or whether you believe that another program, either putting a price on carbon through a fee or maybe increasing the RPS, could help bridge that gap.
Okay, Todd, why don't we start with you?
Thanks. Well, I've got just a couple of things to say. On the first question, I think obviously with the U.S. not playing in the world of providing any kind of financial support, that puts something of a damper on overall financing. Hopefully, other countries will be able to step up and do things like help fill the first replenishment round for the Green Climate Fund. That is part of the kinds of funding that is that goes into adaptation. I don't know. David or someone may be able to fill me in. I don't know if that there are tough sort of negotiation questions right now with respect to adaptation. Adaptation is more importantly kind of based on getting a flow of funds to help poor countries do what they need to do to be resilient. Loss and damage is a perennial difficult question. I think a lot of progress was made first in 2013 in Warsaw, then another step in Paris. It's a delicate issue because there are places where countries like the United States, whoever's the president, and other developed countries can't quite go. But on the other hand, it's super important. I've always thought that this is an issue that needs to seize the attention not just of the UNFCCC, but of the larger UN family, because you have existential challenges that many countries face, and we have to not take it outside the UNFCCC in the sense of shuffling it off, but to broaden the family of institutions that are focused on it. Just one comment on the standards issue, which mostly I don't have much to say about, but with respect to investment standards, I was in China all last week, having lots of interesting meetings, some on the negotiations, some on other things, and I had one with a really fascinating guy who's the key person in China. His name is Ma Jun, working on green finance across the board, trying to build an entire kind of ecosystem of green finance, from green lending to green bonds. And I think that he is also focused on the issue of green investment. Whether it's standards per se, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of interesting work that he is doing in any event. And beyond that, I will pass the baton.
So, when I'm betting you have something to say on that first question too.
Yes. On the adaptation question, I agree with Todd that in the actual negotiations, it's not. There are very few little difficulties around the negotiations on adaptation. The question or the major concern, especially from the vulnerable developing countries, has been twofold: the political profile that adaptation gets globally, and secondly, and it's also linked to the support that adaptation receives. Traditionally, it's been around at 80 to 20 split. 80% of all climate finance has gone to emission reductions, critically important, and only 20% has gone to support adaptation. The Green Climate Fund, one of the major decisions that was taken by the Green Climate Fund during the process of operationalization of the Green Climate Fund was to ensure that there was a balanced 50-50 split between adaptation and mitigation finance. And this has motivated many of the international financial institutions to adopt a similar approach. The Green Climate Fund has been trying really hard to do this, but I believe many of the international financial institutions like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, et cetera, they need to work a lot harder in terms of ensuring that there's a greater distribution of financing to support adaptation and resilience building, especially in the vulnerable countries. One of the key milestones that we'll see over the course of the next few months is the recapitalization of the Green Climate Fund, and whether that coalition that I spoke of earlier that remains strong will truly step up to the plate and help to fill the void created by the U.S. The current president of the United States has made it clear that they will not play with the Green Climate Fund. However, let's see how Europe and other countries who have been fully supportive behind the climate agenda, let's see how they step up in terms of the recapitalization of the Green Climate Fund. But the Green Climate Fund has been a truly game-changing institution. You know, it is focused on promoting transformational change. It has been a long and difficult learning experience, but on the global level, it has really made a difference, especially in the small island developing states, in African countries, and some of the most vulnerable countries in Latin American countries as well. And the final point that I want to make on the adaptation agenda is that, you know, I was in South Carolina 2 weeks ago, Charleston. It has a very close historical link to Barbados. And I met with the mayor as well as the chief resilience officer in South Carolina. Many of the challenges, you know, I'm sure that this also pertains to Maryland and the great state of Virginia. Many of the challenges that small city of Charleston faces are challenges that we face in the Caribbean. So I've challenged my colleagues and friends in the Sister Cities International Alliance. Why can't we, island states who face many of the same challenges from extreme weather events, hurricane storms, coastal inundation, flooding, etc., why don't we form a coalition to exchange best practice and collaborate on resilience building? So I put that out to you, you know, to the WRIs and the Sister City Internationals and many of you in the great states of Maryland and Virginia. We're willing to partner with you on adaptation and resilience building in the absence of any leadership from the federal government.
Great. Secretary Gumbles, let's go to this question on Reggie. And I want you to answer the question on transportation, but let's go broader than that. Let's talk about what would it take to expand Reggie to other sectors as well? I mean, clearly it's working on the power sector. Maryland's emissions have gone down by half in the power sector since 2007. What would be the prospects of expanding the program to other sectors?
Sure.
Because if you're going to hit your big 2030 target now, that's clearly got to be there, whether it's use Reggie or some other mechanism to get there.
Right. Well, I want to say that one of the organizations that Maryland and Virginia are proud to be members of is the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is absolutely 17 states, bipartisan, bicoastal, tracking progress on our states living up to the terms of the Paris Climate Agreement if we were still in it, and are we exceeding that? Now, on the Reggie question, and specifically with the transportation sector, I would say a couple things. One is our state is proud to be part of a very active organization called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. There are a dozen states that are part of that effort, recognizing that in many states, including Maryland, increasingly the transportation sector needs to be the focus of attention and collaboration. It's not, obviously everyone knows this, it's not just the energy sector or the building and housing sector or the agricultural sector. On transportation, honestly, one of our top priorities right now is having regional meetings among those dozen states that are part of the Transportation and Climate Initiative and hearing about how do you in the transportation sector reduce greenhouse gas emissions and how can you do it in a coordinated way thinking regionally. But honestly, one of our priorities right now, and I say this as a state that has a Republican governor, is to push back real hard on EPA proposed rollbacks of the clean car rules under the Clean Air Act. That is a very important strategy on transportation sector progress for greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also a lot of local meetings, citizens, stakeholders, businesses are going to be part of these discussions about do you put in place some type of a cap on carbon emissions in the transportation sector. How would it work? It clearly needs time and discussion among all the different stakeholder groups. And in terms of RGGI, our success has been to be focused on one sector and make sure we get it right, and that these auctions and the way the RGGI program is carried out, the Cap and Invest program in the power sector, is run well and successful. We are, each of our states are looking at other strategies to put a price on carbon, to come up with collaborative mechanisms. It's the power of collaboration is, as everyone knows, is enormous. And when you look beyond your own border to deal with transboundary pollution or a moving sector of public, that's a good start. And we're focused on that, but I know it's going to take some time to consider it either in an individual state or in a regional approach, broadening the RGGI model to other sectors. But it is worth discussion, and it's worth scientific scrutiny and analysis as well.
Great. On that second question, Angela, Val, anything to say on the reliability of these commitments that we're getting at the non-federal level, counting them, accounting for them, making sure that we can actually measure progress from these different actors as we, are really working in almost exclusively a non-federal arena for the time being, and making sure that the rest of the world can actually rely on these commitments as a real, something real that the United States is contributing now.
So Ben mentioned, obviously, we're both members of the U.S. Climate Alliance, and that's something that we're doing in a much more coordinated fashion. But as I mentioned earlier, the bulk of the regulatory work happens at the state level anyway. And so our regulatory programs, for example, Virginia's program to move forward with linking to RGGI is a regulatory program that is established under Virginia's Administrative Procedure Act. It has targets and commitments and enforcement, and it's enforceable under our state law, or Virginia Air Pollution Control Law. So there are requirements and targets built into our own regulatory programs when it comes to transportation sector, mobile source emissions. States also have the ability to regulate emissions and to do it again under the more tangible Administrative Procedure Act. When you're talking about things like emissions reductions associated with reducing the loss of forested habitat, that's a bit more difficult. And so we're working with a coalition of nonprofit partners on developing some mechanisms to understand the value of our natural lands. The same thing with our agricultural sector. Obviously, there's a carbon footprint associated with that. And so understanding what that means, I think, is incredibly important. But for our baseline regulatory programs, our energy sector programs, our transportation sector programs, those that are governed under state law or under federal law, those have a traditional regulatory backing with monitoring and compliance and enforcement protocols that are very similar to what you see at the federal level.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly to that question. First of all, around whether you can trust companies' commitments. I'm a big believer in disclosure, and I think in general, you can trust that companies are probably making more conservative commitments than they're actually going to be able to make. I mean, we certainly have been able to reach our previous $50 billion climate finance initiative 3 years early. We're on track to hit our current $100 billion goal early. But we do disclose a lot of information about how we are tracking and counting and reporting that. And we also disclose a lot of information about the impacts of this financing. So as part of our $100 billion environmental finance goal commitment, we also committed to report on the environmental and social benefits of that financing because we thought it was helpful to begin to put numbers to some of that as well. So, for example, I mentioned the $57 billion that we've financed so far under that initiative. Those financings, our clients have, under that initiative, with our support, helped to avoid 4.5 million metric tons of CO2 emissions and supported over 100,000 jobs. I want to just sort of put a plug in here for the World Resources Institute, which has really been the leader in developing the standard called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for measuring different kinds of CO2 emissions. And I lastly want to just address the question around international financing standards. This has been an area that the finance sector has been able to work pretty collaboratively in. We first started in 2003 with the development of the Equator Principles for Project Finance, which really set out the gold standard for how banks should assess environmental and social risk associated with their project-related lending. And more recently, you've seen the Green Bond Principles. Citi also helped to create those, which are a framework for disclosure around green bonds. What is the use of proceeds for the green bond that you've issued? What are the impacts of that green bond? So I think that standards and sort of coalescing at the appropriate time around common ways to measure and report is really important. If you have a goal, you want to know when you've hit it. But I think that also broad industry frameworks that support, that sort of give you comfort about the greenness or the sustainable area, the sustainable benefits of a transaction, while also allowing for innovation and exploration, are equally important.
So let's take a couple more questions from the audience and with some quick answers. Alden, and there were people over here who had their hands up earlier.
Hi, my name is Fei Yu from the Asian Development Bank. I'm very interested in the climate financing aspect of this. We provided $4.5 billion last year for climate financing in the Asia Pacific region, but that's very small compared to what private sector can do. So I'm very encouraged to hear from both Citibank and also the states that the private sector is finding it profitable or a good business deal to stay the course. Is it, given that the green climate change was originally supposed to be raising $100 billion per year by 2020 to help with the climate fight, and so far has raised a bit more than $10 billion. Do you think by the transparency, improving transparency, providing the information for climate risks in terms of private investments, would this have enough potential to fill the gap that's left by some of the recent developments?
Okay, great. And a quick one from Alden.
Yeah, Alden Meyer, Union of Concerned Scientists. Thanks for doing this. It's great that no other country has followed the U.S. out of the agreement, but as I think we know, you all know, the Paris Agreement was a work in progress, and the promise was that we would ratchet up ambition over time, starting in 2020, to close the gap between the commitments and the under 2-degree temperature limitation goals. I'm wondering if you can say two questions. What is the effect of the U.S. withdrawal or announced withdrawal on the political will of other countries to stick with that ratcheting up of ambition? Maybe starting with the Talanoa dialogue in Katowice and then going into the Secretary General's summit next September. And for the subnational representatives, what are you hoping for out of the Global Climate Action Summit to send a powerful message to national leaders that, come on in, the water's fine, we can decarbonize for fun and profit?
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes here, so let's get some good quick answers.
First, I want to just give a clarifying answer to that first question about climate financing. It's a very often made misconception. The $100 billion was never a pledge to raise that money for the Green Climate Fund per se. It's all climate funding, both publicly delivered and mobilized by public action from the private sector, and it includes the World Bank and all of the regional development banks and all countries' bilaterals. So the Green Climate Fund is a key anchor, but it was never intended to be $100 billion. Is $10 billion a good amount? Probably not. It's probably too low, but it's a start. but it's not that it's 90 billion short. So I just want to be clear about that. All in all, with respect to ambition, I think that that there is an element of mobilization created by countries not wanting to give the United States their way. So on the one hand, that's a good thing. There was certainly, as people on this panel have talked about, there's been a tremendous mobilization internally at the subnational level here. Still, when you get to the point of talking about ratcheting up what you're going to do, looking at the United States not acting, I think some countries will say, then we're going to do more, and some countries are going to say we're going to do less. It's going to be country by country.
Yeah. In the Paris Agreement, and I agree with Todd's comment on the Green Climate Fund, although from a developing country perspective, we'd hope that the Green Climate Fund would mobilize $100 billion. But in the Paris Agreement, there are a number of elements. A number of elements in the Paris Agreement were inserted to serve to help countries, to incentivize countries to enhance ambition. The NDCs, National Determined Contributions, or National Climate Plans for laypersons that were submitted in the lead up to Paris, we all knew they would not be consistent with below 2 degree, let alone 1.5 degree target. Everyone knew that. However, the stated goal of holding the global temperature increase to below 2 degrees, it was recognized that it will be a work in progress, but there were some key elements that countries now need to put in place to incentivize themselves and other partners to increase ambition. One is and this was something that a key element of the United States was a transparency system. If countries know what each other is doing, that helps to incentivize countries to be even more ambitious. The shorter commitment cycles, 5 years. So you go back, you don't lock in ambition over a 10-year period, but over short periods. And before making a new commitment, you get an assessment, a review of the state of the science, the state of the economics to help inform the decision to increase or to submit a new number. So those were some of the key elements that were inserted into the Paris Agreement. And quite frankly, some of them are under threat in the ongoing negotiations, quite frankly, because of the U.S. is no longer displaying that level of leadership. So on the ambition question, I believe countries can do more. We are going to do more as Barbados, as my new prime minister has announced, but we're 0.00000% of global emissions. However, we are going to do more, and many countries, and I think, as David said earlier, that leadership needs to come from around the globe. It needs to come from the small islands. It needs to come from the African countries. Countries in Latin America, like Colombia and Costa Rica, are doing amazing things. So that type of leadership needs to come from all over the world.
Okay, very quickly, how can we fill the climate finance gap while generating fun and profit? I just want to share with you what we see in the finance sector in terms of how quickly this space is changing, and I think what should give us all hope. There are so many financial products that you now see being bent to a sustainable or climate or green outcome. You have our energy bankers that are quite engaged in project finance of renewable energy projects. You have our commodities team that's doing power hedges for renewable energy projects to provide price certainty. You have our ability to securitize lots of small energy efficiency and solar loans into one aggregated security that we then can sell to investors. And then, of course, you have green bonds and sustainability bonds, still new products, and you have the brand new green loans area. So while I think the gap is significant, I do think that we're all leaning in on this problem and that there's real progress up ahead.
Question was about the Global Climate Summit in San Francisco later in the year, and the 3 goals for us. Maryland will definitely be there, and one of them is to continue to share lessons learned and the model surrounding RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, to others around the country and around the world who are interested. The second would be to share ideas about our Climate Leadership Academy for local governments and businesses and individuals on increasing resiliency due to risk of climate impacts. And the third is to put a real emphasis, a growing emphasis on healthy soils and regenerative agriculture in Maryland, and I'm sure this is the case in Virginia as well. Agriculture is the heart and soul of our heritage and economy, and the solutions from the land are there. And so we're real interested in sharing that with others, what Maryland agriculture is doing to increase resiliency and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
So I'll be brief because I think we're probably over time. For us, I think, to your question, telling the business case for decarbonization, one of the most significant drivers for renewable energy investment in Virginia has been Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. Those three companies alone are responsible for over 1 gigawatt of investment in solar energy alone. So we are seeing tremendous progress from the corporate side, and those investments are driving policy changes at the state level. So we're seeing changes within our state legislature, and we just this year, the governor signed a piece of legislation that paved the way for 5,000 megawatts of solar and wind in Virginia, which is a tenfold increase over what was on the books before, and something that probably would not have happened had we not had that investment from those large corporate giants who were saying, this is what we want. When customers are demanding it, then you're going to see policy movement, and I think that's one of the biggest drivers that we're seeing in states like Virginia.
Okay, quickly, David, because our boss is next.
Yeah. First, just a very quick comment on the finance piece. I think it's helpful to think in terms of orders of magnitude. We need the $10 billion plus for the Green Climate Fund. We need the $100 billion that has to be mobilized by public finance, and we're actually over 2/3 of the way to that target, according to our assessments. And then we need the trillion, or really trillions, in finance from multiple sources that are shifted to climate ends. And in many cases, that's a matter of shifting from brown, if you will, to green, and making sure that we undertake that at the scale that's needed. Just on the ambition question, I wanted to add one quick comment to what Selwyn said. I think that it's absolutely already clear that the many smaller countries are ready to move, like Barbados is. In addition to that, we have middle-sized countries and even larger ones that are also beginning to demonstrate their readiness. Just two quick examples. One is that Chile is already looking at its current nationally determined contribution, its climate commitment under Paris, with a view to finding the ways that it can increase its action. And then Mexico has recently passed a law that puts in place a 5-year cycle of examination and strengthening action for itself. And so I think this is a spreading movement in essence.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Now I want to bring up Manish Bhapna, who is Executive Vice President, Managing Director here at the World Resource Institute, for a few final reflections.
Just what an event. Just what a first huge round of applause for the panelists. That was a incredibly stimulating, motivating set of remarks. So I have the unenviable task at 4:02 to sum up this event in 3 minutes. So I'm going to give that a shot. 7 very brief takeaways that I felt we heard today. First, urgency. I think we all recognize and can appreciate the urgency of the challenge. Selwyn, Paula, so many people spoke about the damage, the climate impacts. We're seeing the impacts already today. What we know moving forward, the infrastructure stock in the world is going to double in the next 15 years. The GDP is going to double in 20 years. Urban population is going to double in 40 years. The window of getting this right, of getting kind of a low climate trajectory right, is now. And I think we're moving, as was said earlier, in the right direction. We're kind of making the right direction, but it's not decisive enough. So this point about urgency is absolutely central. Second point, resolve. We heard following kind of Trump's announcement, both Todd and Selwyn spoke a little bit about the coalition around the Paris Agreement remained strong. We heard several people talk about that we are still in movement. The real test will be how do we sustain and enhance that resolve. Selwyn spoke about one of the immediate tests will be the recapitalization of the Green Climate Fund. Will others step up? The third point I thought we heard was really around the economics, that the economics of the transition are becoming increasingly clear and compelling. Why is Citi putting in $100 billion into climate finance? Why is 3 major technology companies investing 1 gigawatt in solar in the country? How is Maryland assessing progress on climate? And the interesting thing about the economics is it is amazing how quickly this has shifted over the past 5 or 7 years. 7 years ago, it was a choice. The dominant discourse was either you did something on climate or you thought about jobs and growth. 3, 4 years ago, we began to recognize that that was a false choice. You could potentially have both. Increasingly, the discourse is that they are mutually reinforcing. You can't have growth without taking climate action. You can't take serious climate action without thinking about growth. And that intellectual kind of journey in the discourse, hugely, hugely important. Fourth point, kind of ambition. Shining points of light. We saw many examples here today, kind of these proof points about what's happening, but the real test is going to be what lies ahead. Barbados, the 100% renewable energy target, but I think the real question will be, as we go to the COP, as we go to 2020, David and others spoke about the ratchet mechanism. Alden spoke a little bit about will people step up? And that's not just on mitigation, as important as that is. It's also on adaptation, it's on finance, it's on support. Fifth point, policy matters, right? How we design policy matters. So we talked about RGGI, we talked about TCFD, we talked about the importance of getting the design of those policies right. We talk about a big test coming up in the COP around the rule book for the Paris Agreement. Getting that right sends the right signals, builds political support, hugely important. Sixth point, politics matters as well. We saw, really interesting examples of bipartisanship around state-level climate action. Most people may recall, you think about the major national environmental legislation in the United States, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, overwhelmingly bipartisan. Clean Water Act was, I think, 86-0 in the Senate. So some of the big questions as we move to the midterms and to the elections, will bipartisanship start to emerge in a more serious way at the national level? And the seventh and last point, undeniable importance of U.S. national government leadership, right? Also important, we can't forget about the importance of that both kind of domestically and internationally. And with that, important to take a long-term view around this. And that gets back to something that Paula said at the outset and something I would like to just say. Paula's been with us for a few years, done a phenomenal job as our global climate director. As many of you may know, she's soon going to be leaving, quite unfortunately, but quite fortunately is going to stay within the community. She's going to RARE to be the managing director of climate and water, an opportunity for her to focus quite a bit more on Colombia, but she'll still remain here in DC, so she will be part of all this community. But I did want in this forum to recognize her leadership at WRI and in her career. For most of you who may not know, she was a lead architect of the Sustainable Development Goals and an absolute passionate champion for thinking about long-term strategies, integrated strategies, bringing climate and development together. So I just want to recognize her, ask you all to join me in a warm round of applause to Paula. Once again, to the speakers, to Andrew, and to all of you for giving us 2 hours of your time. We know how precious that is. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you come back next time. Thank you.